What's up, agents? Bruce Hammer here. I am going to begin in a moment. We're going to have a little class on the new buyer representation agreement that will be released on Wednesday, 7/24, along with a bunch of other new forms related to the buyer representation aspect of the NAR settlement. Um, Let me get my screen set up for you here. Let's see, screen share, go with that. This particular class is going to be quite detailed. Um, there's a lot of stuff to go over. I have some props here on the screen that I'll use to go over this stuff with you and give you a pretty detailed understanding of the new forms. Um, it's not the most exciting stuff in the world, but it's stuff that's extremely important that you know because with these July 24th forms that will be released, there are some major changes going on. And it's not just to these forms. They've redesigned the listing agreement. It's now in sort of a grid format like you're used to seeing with the RPA. Um, they've added a few things. Removed a few things. And just to set the mood here, one of the things, if you have not heard already, that CAR has done is they have removed any and all support for us as agents doing broker to broker compensation. Now, whether you knew that terminology or not, that's what most of us have been doing for decades. The um, the listing agent takes a listing as part of their listing compensation. They agree to pay the buyer's agent a certain portion of it. And that portion that they're going to pay the buyer's agent had been referenced in, for example, MetroList under the commission to buyer's brokerage for decades. That's just the way it's been working. Well, the NAR settlement basically said we can't do that anymore. Doesn't make it illegal to do. There is nothing wrong with one brokerage agreeing to compensate another brokerage for bringing a buyer. But CAR has said that since it's no longer going to be allowed to be referenced in MetroList, we are not going to support it anymore. And they've removed all reference to that way of getting paid from any of their contracts. So one of those contracts that you might have used in the past was a form called a CBC, Cooperative Broker Compensation. They have removed that form. Just to let you know, as an office, we have our own version of a CBC that we have produced. You can get access to that on the Circle app under Forms and Resources. We call it a broker to broker compensation agreement. Um, but with that, we have roughly 9 different forms that you will be using at some point in time or another for working with buyers. Um, and you're going to have to be knowledgeable about these forms, whether you're working with buyers or whether you predominantly work with sellers, because it all mixes together, as you will see. Now, part of the NAR settlement not only talked about not being able to include an offer of compensation within the MLS, it also requires that if you are working with a buyer, you must have a broker representation and compensation agreement or a contract that does that. In some areas where they don't use CAR forms, they might call it something different. Here with CAR, the main form you'll be using is called a BRBC, Buyer Representation and Compensation Agreement. Now, CAR was very specific. Actually, California is very specific, and this will become law January 1st, not just for realtors, but for everybody that is a licensee. But basically, If you do not have a buyer representation agreement, you cannot take your buyer out to look for properties. You must have one signed before you start showing them properties. With that being said, the form that you see on your screen is called a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. I'll refer to it for the most part as a BRBC as we go forward. Going into the form, and you can see here, I have a list of other associated forms that you'll be seeing that we will talk about as we go through this. But we have a form called a BIPP, we have a BCA, we have a COBR, and all these, SPBB and so on and so forth, RPA, all these forms, all these abbreviations, you will see as we go through these things. First thing, obviously, you're going to do date you prepare the buyer representation agreement. You'll be doing all this in your Zip Forms account. So, you'll set up your templates like you have done in the past. And most of the time, a lot of this stuff will pre-fill. But if it doesn't, you got to have the date prepared. You're going to have the brokerage name under here. So it's not your agent name, it's the brokerage name. Because, like all contracts in real estate, it is your broker, Keller Williams or KWCA Premier, whichever DBA you're using, they're the one that has the agreement with your buyer or seller. Coming down here, we see the first important thing that we're going to be talking about, and that is whether the representation is non-exclusive or exclusive. And we'll talk in detail about that in just a minute. California has said again, if you don't have a representation agreement before you take out a client to look at properties, you can't get paid, period. End of story. Also, that representation period cannot exceed 3 months. Now, CAR has taken that position for their forms that they've produced now. But that 3-month period, that is about to become statutory law in California. And that's why CAR is doing this. So effective January 1st, if you are not a realtor subject to the NAR settlement, you will still have to limit your buyer representation agreements to 3 months. The exception to that is if your buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. So when you fill in the dates here, make sure they do not extend 3 months. I'm not talking 90 days, I'm talking 3 months. So count them by the month. I'm going to mention here, and I'll touch on it again in a little bit. If you were to modify or extend your buyer representation agreement, which is perfectly permissible, you want to make sure that the extension period, the original period plus whatever date you have in the extension period, does not exceed 3 months. If it does, the agreement becomes void. So let's just say 5 days before the expiration of this agreement, so you're at the end of your 90 days, you're 5 days before 90 days. 5 days beforehand, you write an extension and your client signs it that day. And you actually, instead of extending it for, 2.66 months, or whatever that is, instead of extending it for 90 days less 5 that you still have on the current BRBC, you just extended it for another 90 days from the date that your client is signing it. You would actually be going over 3 months, and the effect would be making your agreement with them void. So just pay attention to that if you do extend or modify. Type of representation. This is really a critical thing to understand. And as we go through these forms, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth, sometimes to different forms, but I'll come back to this form where we've left off. So type of representation, you can have non-exclusive, and the form you can see will default to a non-exclusive type of representation. If you wish to make it exclusive, you must check this box right here. If you don't check the box, it stays non-exclusive. You also, if it's going to be exclusive, you have to initial in paragraph 15. We'll see that shortly. So what's the difference? Well, if you go to non-exclusive, and all I've done here is I've just gone farther down in the form where it has more definitions. But you can see here, non-exclusive representation requires broker involvement. So you only get paid if there was broker involvement with the property. How do you define broker involvement? Well, they define it for you right here. Broker involvement would be one or more of these characteristics. The buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker, by you. The broker showed the property to buyer virtually. Yeah, you can do that. You can go through there with your, Facebook video or whatever you call it. I'm not all up on the technology, but you can take a virtual tour of the house and answer your buyer's questions and that sort of thing. That would count. You submitted to the seller a signed written offer on the property. That would be broker involvement. You performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed specific documents or disclosures with the buyer. The property was introduced by you or one for which you acted on the buyer's behalf. This is an important note here. However, merely sending the buyer a list of properties is not considered broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer, specifically or assisting buyer in the potential acquisition of the property or communicating with the seller or the seller's agent regarding the buyer's potential purchase of the property. So if it is if it is non-exclusive representation, it requires that you actually take additional action. Here's the big difference. If you have exclusive representation, it doesn't matter if you work with the buyer and they acquire a property or not. If you have exclusive representation, the broker is entitled to compensation if they acquire a property during the period of the contract. And the BRBC is a contract between you and the buyer. It can also be through any extension of the contract with or without broker involvement. So even if the buyer lied to you when you took the buyer representation agreement, you asked them, are you under a buyer representation agreement with any other brokers? And they lied to you and they said yes. And that buyer representation agreement is for the same type of property I'm looking for with you. But they lied and they told you they didn't have that agreement. The buyer theoretically is on the hook to both you and the other buyer's agent, if they buy a property that occurs during the term of the representation agreement or through any extension. All right. So buyer representation agreement exclusive is the way I would recommend you go. But that's the difference between the two. All right. Oh, and another difference we'll get to shortly is cancellation rights. Each one has its own type of cancellation rights and how long it takes to succeed in canceling. So we'll get to that also as well. Going back to the BRBC. All right, we've covered buyer representation, property types, and types of property to be acquired. So as we said, this is a contract between you and the buyer. You are agreeing to find them a specific type of property. You should fill out the property type that they are looking for here, whether it's single family residence, you would check that, multifamily, commercial, vacant land, whatever. You should also pin it down to the counties and cities. That will help your enforcement of this in the event of a buyer breach. There is also an additional form that is highly, actually in this particular form, you must complete it, and it's called a BIPP. That is Buyer Identification of Preferences and Priorities. You're going to want to, as I said, fill in this information, the city, the county, but also check this box and fill in this BIPP form. And the reason you want to do this um, is because in the event you have some kind of a conflict down the road, let's just say at closing, the buyer says, well, you didn't find me what I wanted. You found me something else and I'm buying it, but it's not what I told you I wanted. Therefore, you didn't fulfill the terms of the contract. By having this form, you can document exactly what was covered, what you were supposed to find for the buyer. And there's also an additional form we can fill out if there's an exception to that and they really want to buy it, that you can use to help support your position that you did earn your fee. But let's take a look at this form. So as I made a note here, the BIPP helps the buyer's agent know what is important to a buyer, such as price range, number of bedrooms and baths, single-story home versus multi-level property, school district, green features, and accessibility. So buyer identification of preferences and priorities. And you can see here, a lot of different variables they can indicate to you what they're looking for. I want to point out this form is also a confidential form. You cannot provide a copy of this or give this information to a listing agent or a seller. If you think about it, if the more information you're giving to a listing agent, telling them that, yeah, this is what my client was looking for, and by the way, your home has these features, that might degrade your negotiation ability with that seller if the seller is aware that they're negotiating on a property that fits perfectly what your client was looking for. So this form is considered confidential unless your client authorizes you to share it, and there would be no reason for your client to do so. All right. So BIPP, this is a form that you will want to do along with your BRBC. All right. So that's where that's where the client is telling you what they want. If you go down as part of this forms package, and I'll tell you they're doing this the same way. They're going to streamline or standardize the way they do this with the new forms packages. You probably know when you order, for example, a residential purchase agreement from your CAR subscription, you basically get a packet of forms. You're not just getting the RPA. You're getting an agency disclosure, you're getting fair housing, you're getting a consumer disclosure. Um, there's probably 6 or 7 different forms you get in those packages. The first one is always an agency disclosure, and then you have all these other forms. Well, they've redesigned the packets with this release. You'll still have the agency disclosure up front, and then you'll have the actual form that you're looking for, and then you'll have all the other added forms and disclosures. So one of the new forms that they're adding into this package is called a BCA. That is Broker Compensation Advisory. This will be in the listing package as well. So this is for sellers and for buyers. And the purpose of this form is to tell both sellers and buyers, this is how buyers agents get paid, and this is, how listing agents get paid. And so it just goes into sections. Um, it starts off by saying when the sellers list their property for sale through a real estate broker, they agree to pay the seller's broker when the escrow closes. And it talks about it being fully negotiable. So when you go into a listing, just like when you're working with a buyer's agent, These disclosures are part of the actual forms now, talking about listing agreement compensation being fully negotiable. There is no fixed, there is no standard, there is no common amount that we quote to anybody. What you can quote is, this is what I charge to sell your home, or this is what I charge to represent a buyer. Um, but there is nothing standard. And you don't ever want to say that to a client, because when you start talking about standard fees, standard commissions, then you start getting involved potentially in antitrust. And that is a crime. So don't do it. Um, Optional compensation. So this would be on the listing side again. Listing, they talk about how they're going to charge the seller. And then the new listing agreement has a box for optional additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. So, for example, if a buyer just approaches the listing agent and says, "Hey, I don't have an agent. I don't want an agent, but I like your house and I want to put an offer in on it. I don't want you representing me either." So now you have a situation where you have an unrepresented buyer and you are working for the seller. So because you're working for the seller, you and the buyer doesn't want you, you would want to complete this CAR form BNA, that's buyer non-agency. Buyer's going to sign that. They're acknowledging you don't work for them. But you are going to have to work a little more than if you're just working for the seller. So this would be where you list in what you're going to charge if you have to work with an unrepresented buyer. Um, they have removed from the listing agreement any references to broker to broker compensation, or even the seller paying the buyer's broker. Um, that's just not existent in the forms anymore. Um, they are trying, CAR is trying to push us towards basically the buyer's agent may ask the seller to pay the fee within the RPA, or alternatively, they want the buyer to pay their own agent. Sometimes you might have situations where a third party might be willing to pay the agent as well, for example, a lender. Um, but if we want to have an arrangement where the listing agent is offering to pay or is negotiating to pay the buyer's agent, then we have to have a separate contract between those two. And as I said, we have put a document onto the Circle app for that instance if it does come up. It also talks about the broker may represent both buyer and seller as dual agency. That hasn't changed. Still legal here in California. This would be obviously a buyer approaches the listing agent. Maybe they come into an open house or something and says, "Yeah, I want you to represent me too. I want to buy this house." That's your typical dual agency situation. Could also be dual agency if another agent from our office brings a buyer and wants to buy your uh, seller's listing. So that's that. Now, as far as buyers, which is the topic of this video, again, it starts off with buyer compensation, fully negotiable. Never forget that. We don't use fixed, we don't use standards. It's whatever you charge to represent your buyer or whatever you negotiate with the buyer to represent your buyer. Requirements for written agreements. Per the NAR settlement, we must have written agreements. Talks about advantages of written agreements. Now, this is the way, it lists that buyer's agents can be paid. Buyer pays the compensation through pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. We've been looking so far at the BRBC. There's also a form. It's kind of like BRBC Lite. It's the light version. It's called a PSRA, and we'll go through that also. We can also have the seller paying the compensation. That's where you write your buyer's offer on the RPA form, and you check a box saying you want the seller to pay compensation to the buyer side. and it attaches this form called a SPBB, that's seller payment to buyer's broker. And it becomes part of the contract. So if the seller agrees to it, then the seller would compensate the buyer's agent at close of escrow. If the seller doesn't agree to that, they would have to counter, because the SPBB becomes part of the purchase offer. So if, just like any terms of an RPA, if the seller doesn't like them, they have to issue a counter offer. So in this case, they would have to counter out the SPBB form. Um, let's see. Buyer's agent, as we said before, could negotiate an agreement directly with the seller. Um, and that's about it on this form. And the form is designed for both on the listing side for sellers to sign, on the buyer side for buyers to sign. Okay. Going back up, let's see here. All right. We've covered the BCA. Amount of compensation. You're going to fill this in on two spots. One up here, and then there's also a spot on the very last page of the BRBC, and it is on the last page because you have to advise the seller. If you're asking the seller to pay compensation on behalf of the buyer to you, you have to be able to document that this is what the buyer has agreed to pay you. Why do you have to do that, you might ask? Well, the rules are you cannot receive compensation that is any higher than what the buyer has agreed to pay you. So let's just say, for example, the buyer agrees to pay you 2 of whatever you're counting, whether it's commissions, apples, um, bottles of milk or cartons of milk, whatever. If it's the number 2, and all of a sudden you find out that the seller is willing to pay 3 of whatever it is, the most you can receive is the 2 that's listed on your BRBC. So remember that. So you're going to put either a percentage in, or you're going to check this box and put a fixed amount, or, there's many ways you can do this, and I'll leave that up to you guys. Let's see. Payments received by broker from seller or others. So if the broker receives compensation from the seller or anybody else for broker's representation, the amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation. But again, it says you cannot receive any amount in excess of that. Continued right for payment of broker-involved properties. So you'll recall that on the RPA, I'm sorry, on the listing agreement, there used to be a section, and I always called it a protection period, where you could say that if anybody represented by me or anyone else toured the property, toured my listing during the term of the agreement, and then came back within a certain period of time after the listing expired or was canceled and decided to buy the property, then the seller was obligated to pay you your commission. And the reason that was done is sometimes you had buyers and sellers that would conspire together, and they'd say, well, my listing's going to expire in a week. Just hold off until it expires, come back later, and then, we can do this without the real estate agents. Well, we called that a protection period. Well, for some reason, CAR doesn't like that term. So they now call that a continuation period. That's all this is. But they built it into the buyer representation agreement. So if you fill in a number here, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever reasonable period you want to throw in here, and the buyer that you had this contract with doesn't want to buy a property that you show them, but within that period of calendar days after this listing or this buyer representation agreement cancels or expires, they decide to go back and end up buying that property, even if they are working with another agent, they would still owe you your compensation. So that's why you always want to fill in a number of days here. I said earlier when I was describing the difference between non-exclusive and exclusive representation, there are differences in the cancellation rights. So you can see here, essentially, if it's exclusive, the cancellation becomes effective 30 days after the cancellation form is delivered. If it's non-exclusive, it becomes effective upon receipt immediately, or you can check a box here and change that. But the form that you use to cancel is called a COBR, and we'll take a quick look at that. So there's a couple things to remember on this form. If it's unilateral and it's a non-exclusive, unilateral means one party or the other decides to cancel, not both together in agreement or mutually. And that's typically the way, these types of agreements would actually get canceled. One party says to the other, you know what, I'm not feeling the love. Um, I think we're better off. I'm going to cancel. They send a cancellation over. So that's a unilateral cancellation. But if it's a non-exclusive representation, the cancellation is effective immediately upon receipt of the COBR form. But the broker is entitled to compensation if during the term of the BRBC, the buyer, I'm sorry, if during the term of the contract, the buyer purchases a property and there was broker involvement. With a unilateral or exclusive cancellation, that's effective 30 days after receipt, but the broker is entitled, so non-exclusive again, it did require broker involvement. Exclusive, it doesn't matter if there was broker involvement or not. If, during the term of that contract or any extension, buyer purchase of property that fits the contract's parameters, i.e. single family home, duplex, etc., whether or not the broker was involved, the broker would get paid, even if the buyer acts alone or with a different broker, so long as the other requirements are met. Now, the form, it's pretty simple. If you look through it, it tells you, and by the way, these forms that I'm going over today, you notice there's a lot of red print in them. That's because we don't have the most recent version that has been released yet, because those forms aren't being released for 2 more days. But we needed to get some training ready for you and get it out there. So this is the most recent draft version of the forms. And the red writing you see here are the most recent changes they've made to the draft versions. That's all they are. These are about as close as we are going to be able to get to what the final versions will look like. But as you can see here, it gives you a lot of guidance within the form, depending on whether you had exclusive or non-exclusive representation, how you have to cancel. And actually the form is even designed to be used not just for a unilateral cancellation when one or the other of you, buyer or buyer's agent or buyer, decides to cancel, but it is designed so that you can also have a mutual cancellation. So the big difference is you can see like a unilateral cancellation of an exclusive representation. It's effective 30 days after the receipt of the COBR form. But even in that circumstance, both parties could agree to cancel it effective sooner. Now, this one also provides for, where am I looking here? Mutual cancellation. So if you both agree to cancel, if you look up here, regardless of the type of representation, buyer and broker may agree to mutually cancel the BRBC, the buyer representation agreement, immediately or upon X days after the last signature on the mutual cancellation box. The difference is if you cancel unilaterally, it only takes a buyer or buyer's agent to cancel, one or the other. If you cancel mutually, it requires that you have both signatures. If you don't have both signatures on a mutual cancellation, it is not a valid cancellation. All right. And going back to the BRBC, I wanted to really cover this section here, buyer financial personal information. Now, there is a form, it's called a BFPI, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But one of the things about the BFPI, so if you look at this next box, G2, and this is described in section 9B of this form, but it talks about, there's two boxes here. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. The other one is buyer intends to use a lender which doesn't allow buyer to pay compensation to a broker. You should always be having a discussion about this with your buyer as you're filling out the form. Because I'll ask you, wouldn't it be, and this is a rhetorical question, wouldn't it be nice as you're taking your buyer out to know for certain that there is no way in the world they could ever afford to pay your fee as a buyer broker agent? Hang on 1 second, it's getting really cold in here. I need to turn this up. Sorry about that. It would just, if you're gonna spend the time and energy trying to find your client a property expecting to be paid, wouldn't it be nice to know up front that, hey, number one, your buyer can't pay you, or they're at least saying they can't pay you. And number two, what that means is, since I'm assuming you don't want to work as a gratuitous agent, having the same liability and the same responsibilities to your buyer that you would if you're getting paid, you don't want to do that for nothing. That means you have to find a deal where the seller is willing to compensate the buyer side, right? Which means using that SPBB form in conjunction with your RPA when you fill it out. But what this section does is it gives you an opportunity to interview your client as you're doing their intake. They tell you they don't have enough funds to pay the buyer's broker, or they're using a lender that can't pay, or that says they can't pay. So then you would want to add this BFPI form. And this form takes a deep dive into their lending situation, their finances. Are they a first-time home buyer? Let's go over here. I'll take a quick look at this. So you can see here, and I put a note, this form helps a buyer's agent assess the buyer's qualifications for the property that the buyer wants to purchase, or the type of property. Factors include amount and source of their down payment, maximum loan amount, type of financing, whether they currently rent or own, whether they have experience with property, or are they a seasoned, buyer of homes, whether they're a real estate agent. Why is that important? Well, you might recall, if you're representing a licensee, you have to disclose that in your contract to the seller. And this form would be provided with the BRBC, or the buyer is required to complete it within 5 days after signing the BRBC. And you can see here, it goes into all sorts of questions about their financing information, if they've already established a lender that they're working with, type of buyer they are, type of purchase they're doing, a little information about them. Are they do they own their home? Are they renting? What kind of experience they have? Are they a real estate licensee? What are their, are they relocating for a job? School start date requirements, things like that. Again, this form itself is also confidential, cannot disclose this to the sellers that you're working with or the listing agents you're working with. All right. But this form is not going to be required for our office, but it is highly suggested that you use it because, again, it's good to know for certain what their situation is and whether you're going to be stuck being a gratuitous agent because sometimes you're going to work with a buyer and you may not be able to get a seller to say, yeah, I'll pay this fee. Which actually brings me back to one other topic I want to mention. When you are working with your buyers and you are ready to start actually going out and looking at the stuff you found in the MLS, it used to be probably, I mean, most agents are still doing this. When you find a property that fits what your buyer is looking for in the MLS, I always pick up a phone and I would say to the agent, is the property still available? Because sometimes, they have 3 days to code it as pending. Is the property still available? I always ask, they don't always tell how many offers they have on the property and what the quality of those offers are. I always ask if it's pretty certain we'll maybe writing an offer. Are there any special requirements the seller needs? Do they need a rent back? Do they need, have they already pre-opened title with a certain company? I want to make that, the offer as sweet as I can. So I want to know these things. What's going to happen now is you're still going to want to make those calls, but you're going to be talking to them also about, is your seller willing to contribute to the buyer's agent's fee? In addition to, any of these other things. You might ask, Mr. Agent, are you willing to contribute to my fee? Because they aren't able to list that in the MLS. But maybe he has an arrangement with the seller and maybe he is willing to pay your fee. That would be one of those circumstances where you'd have to use a broker to broker compensation agreement as a side agreement with that agent so you can get paid, or so that the brokerage can get paid so that you can be paid. So make sure you make those calls and ask those questions because that will tell you how you need to write your offer and whether you need to include that SL or SBPP form with your offer. Now, as a side note, what do you do when you call that agent and the listing agent says, hell no, my seller's not paying anything? Well, I would argue that you should still check that box on the RPA and include the seller payment to buyer broker form asking for payment. And the reason I say that is, real estate agents and brokers were professional negotiators. And yeah, listing agent may have told you that on the phone, but listing agent may have just been posturing. Also, the seller doesn't know the quality of your offer yet. The seller may look at your offer and they may do a net sheet, and the seller may say, yeah, look at what I'm going to net. I'm okay paying the buyer's agent this fee in order to make this deal work. Okay. So, the argument I'd offer is you should always ask the seller to pay your fee, whether the agent says they will or not. All right, moving on here. So we've already talked about exclusive versus non-exclusive and broker involvement. And payment obviously is still going to go through escrow. But here, since this is a contract between the buyer and the buyer's broker, buyer is irrevocably assigning the broker the compensation from the buyer's funds in escrow. Buyer agrees to submit to escrow any funds needed to compensate the broker. Broker may submit this agreement as instructions to compensate the broker to any escrow. So you're allowed to give this form out Typically, though, you can use the last page of this form, and I'll show you that in a minute. Let's just say the seller agrees to compensate buyer's agent as part of the contract. But also you have the listing agent that's agreeing to compensate. Just remember, you can never get more than what you've asked for in your buyer broker agreement, or for what you can never get more than what the buyer has already agreed to pay you. Now, that is not to say that you cannot do a modification of your buyer representation agreement. So you can actually modify your compensation with that. You can modify, um, so backtracking a little bit, CAR has done away with the form known as an MT, modification of terms. In that form's place, they have introduced two new forms. The first one is called an MT-LA, modification of terms for a listing agreement. And that does exactly what it sounds like. The second is a modification of terms, MT-BR, buyer representation. So within that modification of terms, you can modify this BRBC form. You can modify the amount of compensation. You could, because it has a nice little section where you can write free form, you could modify the compensation for a particular property that you are putting an offer in on. So that way it keeps the rest of the agreement the same. It just modifies the compensation for one particular property. So it's a very flexible form for you to use. Let's see here. Properties excluded from representation. So let's just say the buyer had worked with another broker and they have an exclusive representation. They had looked at a property and now the buyer is with you, but the buyer has decided, hey, I really like this other property that I saw and I want to put an offer in on it. Well, you can go through the BRBC back on the first page, and you can exclude certain properties from having to owe this new broker, you, compensation if they purchase one. Conflicts with other brokers. And I am sure this is going to happen. There are going to be times where you're going to work with a buyer who also had an exclusive agreement with some other agent, and they overlap the date period on those agreements because, buyer Jim decided he didn't like working with his former agent anymore, and they still had 2 months left to go on their exclusive BRBC, and they just snuck around and cheated on, broker Jim, and started, having an affair with you, and signed a new exclusive broker representation agreement, and now the buyer buys a property through you. Well, the other broker, if they want to pursue it, they have a valid claim against that buyer. Not a valid claim against you, but a valid claim against the buyer. And it works the same way if you were the first broker. And I would envision circumstances where you're going to have multiple brokerages with BRBCs that are overlapping on certain buyers. And so that's why it's incumbent upon you, when you sign a BRBC with a buyer, make sure you do that question and answer and find out, did you sign anything with any other agents? Because you could be obligated under a contract with both of us if that's the case. This little section here it's on page 3 of 5 of the BRBC, section 8. I wanted to point this out to you because, and you've probably heard this from other people recently since the NAR settlement, but it's important enough where I raise this today. if you're a listing agent or if you have been a listing agent, you've really had to have your A game on because you've got to prepare, a market analysis. You got to show the seller what your marketing plan is going to be. You might be doing staging. There's photography involved. You have to draft marketing verbiage for your flyers, for your virtual presence, for your online presence, all that good stuff. You actually have to work. But up until now, the work of a buyer's agent has been, I'm just going to say, not quite as intense as for a listing agent. And basically, the commission had already been negotiated for you. It was in the MLS. You or the buyer found a property, you took them out, you wrote up an offer, and then you might have called for a couple of inspections, help them, do a couple of inspections, and basically walk it through the close. Now, when you are filling out or when you're completing your buyer representation agreements, you're going to be really having to convey to that buyer what it is that you actually do for them to earn this money. It's not going to be enough, at least for most people, it won't be enough to just say, yeah, I'll show you a house and I'll write the offer. I mean, how is that, how does that justify your existence or your fee that you're going to be trying to collect? But if you look on this form under 8B, it actually gives you some talking points that you can use to add, to your presentation, because you're going to be earning the right to represent this buyer for the most part. I've seen some agents in our office who have posted things on Facebook, things like, these are the 150 things I'm going to do for you when I represent you as a buyer of your next dream home. And I think that is the kind of marketing that's going to be important as we move forward. So at least when you're meeting with a buyer, take a look at some of this stuff that you can talk about when you are trying to earn their business. Buyer obligations. I like this. Buyer has a good faith obligation. They agree to timely view and consider properties selected by the broker and negotiate in good faith to acquire the property, and buyer further agrees to act in good faith toward the completion of any contract entered into for a property. Now, just like before, buyer has cancellation rights based on contingencies, inspection periods, all that good stuff. But they, just like before, and maybe it wasn't said enough, they're also expected to work in good faith towards the completion of that property. That form that I showed you that I recommended that you have the buyers complete, especially when they tell you that they tell you in advance they can't pay a buyer's broker. Well, this goes to that. And it says, buyer shall provide relevant personal and financial information, including but not limited to proof of funds needed to complete the purchase of the property, and satisfy the obligation to pay broker, and a pre-approval, pre-qualification letter to broker to assure buyer's ability to acquire the property. If buyer fails to provide such information, or if buyer does not qualify financially to acquire property, then the broker may cancel this agreement in writing. And then it goes on to say, and this was added in this most recent draft, if either box is checked, that's the two boxes where they're saying they can't pay, or they're using a lender that says we won't allow the buyer to pay. If either box is checked for any property for which the buyer writes an offer to purchase, A, the buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting that the seller compensate buyer's broker. That's that SBPP form, or SPBB form, seller payment to buyer's broker. And B, for a transaction, this agreement meaning the buyer representation agreement. This agreement is contingent upon seller or others or both agreeing to pay the broker the full amount that the buyer is obligated to pay the broker. So one of the things you'll talk about with the buyer is, they tell you they can't pay this fee. You can say, well, the way we're going to do this is we will always ask the seller to pay. And if the seller doesn't agree to pay, the buyer representation agreement says that you are not obligated to pay me. Now, the conundrum this may create is legally, if they have advised you in advance that they can't pay the buyer broker fee, and your hope and prayer is that a seller is going to pay that when you make the offer, you could theoretically have a situation where the seller says, I'm not paying this, but the buyer says, I still want the house, and I realize that if I use you, that I have to pay you, and of course you don't want to be a gratuitous agent. But the buyer says, I still want the house. I will just go to the seller and I'll represent myself, or maybe the listing agent will represent me. The problem with that is then you're going to get into a dispute. You can see here, this agreement is contingent upon seller or others or both agreeing to pay the fee that the buyer is contractually obligated to pay the broker. Well, that means you have a contingency here. If the seller says we're not going to pay, then this agreement can't force the buyer to pay you. If the buyer could get the property without having to pay you by just going directly to the seller, they can do that and they won't have to pay you. So you may be in a situation where you have to just wash your hands of it, and that's unfortunate, but at this point, that's the way this stuff has been written. So we'll see how things get modified as we go a little farther into this brave new world of real estate, but this is the way it is right now. All right, buyer material issues. There is a form that you can use. It's called a BMI-SP, where if there is something specific to a particular property that, even though it does not meet the criteria that your client told you that they wanted, but they've decided that, well, I've looked at this house, I really do like it, even though it isn't ideal for me, and it's not one of the things that I said I identified as being important to me when I filled out that BIPP form, but I still want to buy the property. Well, this form here you can use to make an exception to what you were supposed to be looking for them. That's all this is. It's an exception form. It's a, let's see here. This agreement is governed by a requirement for mediation between you and the buyer prior to taking any other court action of any kind. So reading between the lines, what I just said is you can take court action. You are required to do mediation first. If you do mediation, both parties, you and the buyer, split the mediation fees. If the amount in dispute is less than $10,000 after mediation, you can take them to small claims court. Actually, take that back. If it's less than 10,000, you can skip mediation and go directly to small claims court and try to get your compensation. But if it's not within the jurisdiction of the small claims court, then you have to go through mediation first. And I think, this is the last page. Once again, it talks about exclusive representation. If that's the case, if it is exclusive, then the buyer also must initial here. If you're missing an initial here, then it's going to default not to exclusive, but to non-exclusive. So make sure you get that. It talks about cancellation and the 30-day requirement if it's exclusive. Um, Here is where you're going to fill in for a second location the amount of compensation that the buyer will be paying to the buyer's agent. The reason it's here on this last page is because you'll be able to tender this page to the seller if you're asking the seller to pay um, the buyer's agent's fee. And you can also submit this to escrow. It will be signed by the buyers, um, the brokers, and this is all that they should need in order to be able to compensate you once it closes escrow. All right, I think that was it for those. Now, I want to go, see, already canceled that. Seller payment to buyer broker. I wanted to cover this form. Um, so as you can see here, the top of this form, it says the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated in and made a part of the purchase agreement, dated such and such. You want to make sure that you fill this in completely, this entire top section. And I don't need to tell you what to put here. It's spelled out in plain English. But it's important you fill this out because when you fill this form out correctly and you tie this back to the purchase contract that you're going to send with this, I recommend if you send it DocuSign, you have it in the same DocuSign envelope with your purchase contract. That means that this form and the RPA become one. They can't accept the RPA terms without accepting this. So if the seller does not want to pay you, or maybe they want to pay you an amount lower than what you list here, then they would have to actually write a seller counteroffer. Because the terms here are as important as the terms in the RPA. They're all one. Can't change one without a counteroffer. So you would put the amount that you're asking for here. Again, this amount should be no higher than what you have in your buyer representation agreement. And it says right here, seller shall only be obligated to pay a buyer's broker the lesser of the amount specified in 1A, or 2, the amount buyer is obligated to pay buyer's broker pursuant to their buyer representation agreement. So let's see. I think to go through the I want to show you this form as well. I talked about earlier, I talked about a form. I consider it kind of like the buyer representation agreement light version. And that's this form here. It's called a property showing and representation agreement. This form here, it is only for up to 3 properties. The term can only be a maximum of 30 days, and it can only be a non-exclusive type of arrangement. So when would you use something like this? Well, if you get a call one day and the person says, yeah, I'm driving up from the Bay Area. I found this property, on such and such site. I'm an investor. I would just like to see this property really quickly. Maybe I have another one too that I want to see today. Can you arrange showings for me? And you say, sure. You send this form out to them. You fill in both of the addresses there. You send it out to them, fill it out via DocuSign, or you can do it in person once they get out here, as long as you do it before you show the properties. You might put the representation period as, we did it today, 7/22/24, ending at 11:59 p.m. on 7/22/24. It'll be good for one day, but it could be good, as you can see, for up to 30 days. You fill in the amount of your compensation that you negotiate with them or expect to get. Again, you guys are independent contractors. You determine what you are worth and what what you can negotiate with your clients. That's what you fill in here. And then there's a note here that says, in the event that the broker receives compensation for the seller or others, just like before, that'll be credited towards the buyer's obligation. Um, and that's basically this form. You can see it's a lot shorter. Um, but Oh, the other thing you can use this form for, if you're just going out with a client and you're driving down the street with them, or you hear there's an open house on a certain street, you can take this with you, just pop into a few open houses or something like that. It's just something that you can have that makes you legal and official with your client. And it's probably not as intimidating as as this buyer representation and compensation agreement. Let's see, I wanted to go over the modification of terms for buyer representation. Again, this form will not be available until the 24th. On the 24th, the old form, which was just the MT, that's going to disappear and it's going to be replaced by this form. But you can see here, you can change the expiration date on your buyer representation agreement. Remember, you never want to change it to a term that will have it in force for longer than a 3-month term at a time. So, because that will make your agreement void and you will not be entitled to payment. You can change the amount of compensation if you want. If you wanted to, you could change the amount of compensation only for a particular property here. And then there's an other section that you can use for whatever other purpose you find it might be appropriate to use this form. And once your agreement is coming to an end, or you cancel, either one, if you've shown properties to your buyer, this would be the form you'd want to use. It establishes that the buyer's broker has been involved in a property that a buyer might purchase. You can use this form to establish that you've already put an offer in on a property if you want. But mainly it's going to be used for triggering a right to be compensated at the end of your agreement. So, you can update it periodically. You can see up towards the top, it has who the parties are. It has the date of your agreement, when it terminates, and you can list here any properties that you've shown that you want to put them on notice for, that these are involved properties that you have expended time and energy to work with them and show them, or get them. And you see here it has a spot for the buyer to sign, but they've just added this to the form. It'll be on the final version. Note to buyer: once this notice of broker involved properties has been delivered to you, it's effective. Does not require them to sign and acknowledge they've received it. Let's see. And last but not least, there's a couple things on the RPA that have changed that I want to cover with you real quick. As you can see, let's see. So section G1, you can see here it talks about a seller credit, if any, to the buyer. What this is referring to, this is what we really do refer to as concessions. If you think of buyer concessions or seller concessions to a buyer, this is what we're really talking about. And when you use the word concessions in the context of this contract, it is not talking about payment of a seller to compensate a buyer's broker. This is talking about things like paying the buyer's loan points, or paying other expenses for recurring and non-recurring closing costs. So just keep in mind, do not use G1 to reference a credit to pay for buyer's brokers compensation. If you want to do that when you write the offer, you're going to use G3. You're going to check this box that says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. And when you check this box, it's going to add in this form SPBB, seller payment to buyer's broker, which we've already gone over. And that is the part that you're going to be asking the seller to pay your fee. Now, I want to take a moment while we're here and talking about this, because MetroList MLS, who most of you, that's your primary MLS, and I'll tell you, each MLS is going to have their own rules on this. But effective August 12th, MetroList is going to be removing the commission field, commission payable to buyer's agent, from all listing profiles. That's effective August 12th. So two things. One is August 12th, you're probably going to want to, even though it's not the 17th yet, you're probably going to want to implement these new forms as if it were the 17th. You're going to use the SPBB. You'll be using the new buyer representation agreement. Just assume, for the sake of argument, that August 12th is the 17th. And the reason is because there's not going to be any offer of compensation in the MLS. So you're going to want to use these forms. That being said, I talked about this G1 here. This is the true definition of seller concessions. But MetroList has said, and there'll be a broker town hall with MetroList that I'll be attending tomorrow or the next day, I think, where I'll get confirmation on this. But this is what I got directly from MetroList compliance. MetroList has said that they will, in the confidential agent remarks, allow you to use very vague, ambiguous sort of terms to say things like, seller will consider concessions, or contact listing agent for possible seller concessions, things like that. Now, most often, as I said earlier, when you say seller concessions, the thought is usually going to be towards recurring and non-recurring closing costs. I think most agents are going to put those comments in there, or many agents will put those comments in there. And what they're actually trying to say is sort of a code for call the listing agent because the seller may be willing to pay the buyer representation compensation. And so when you see that, that might be something, one added, nod to say, to reinforce that, yeah, you really do want to call the listing agent and talk about this. The other thing is, and this is the word that I got, is under the terms field in MetroList. They're going to add two new checkboxes that you can check. One is going to say something like buyer credit considered, and the other will say something like buyer credit not considered. And my understanding, at least at this point, is that these will likely be searchable fields that you can search as part of your normal property searches. That is not to say that you should do any filtering when you're looking for homes for your buyer. Ethically, legally, you're not supposed, if you're exercising your fiduciary duty to your client, it shouldn't matter, the amount of the compensation that you're going to be paid. When you search, you should not do filtering. You should search all properties that meet that buyer's description. Now, I'm not saying that's not going to happen. I'm sure there are agents that'll do that, but you're not supposed to be doing that. Let's see. The other thing that I wanted to point out again, I may have talked to some of you all about this before. They've added with this new RPA, they've added a new contingency, one for insurance. You've probably heard in California, there's major problems getting homeowners insurance. Many companies have left the state due to fire expenses and cost of rebuilding. So now we have a contingency where your buyer has 17 days to get insurance that is acceptable to them, both with the company and with the cost. You'll see here, if you look at 8D, it talks about, I'll go down in a second, talks about the cost of getting that insurance. So imagine, if you will, turns out your buyer could get insurance, but they could only get it with California Fair Plan, where it's going to be 5,000 a year. That, that is not a reasonable contingency. So what they've said is you have to be able to get insurance at a cost that's acceptable to you. They've also, under time of possession, it defaults to upon notice of recordation now. We had some circumstances where agents would put like 6 p.m. here, um, or or they wouldn't put anything. They would just leave it, when the deed records. And some of the agents, listing agents, would require the buyers to wait until the end of the day when the sellers finally finished getting out and things like that. This makes it clear there's no way you can doubt it, that time of possession is to be turned over as soon as the escrow company lets you know that the deed has recorded. And let's see here. This is the insurance section I was talking about. This agreement is, as specified in paragraph blah, contingent upon buyer's assessment of the availability and approval of the cost for any insurance policy desired. So that'll protect your buyers much better. That by the same token, since it is now a contingency and you have a limited period of time to do this, it was oftentimes common for buyers to wait until right before the close before they locked up their homeowners insurance. You want to get them working on this right away. So that way you don't have any delays or anything like that. You're not in violation of the contingency, and you don't have listing agents sending you a notice to perform to remove the contingency. So there's that. And I think that is, oh, I did want to point this out. This is the last page of the RPA. Under the real estate broker section, there used to be references here to broker compensation and the information from the CBC. That has all been removed here. As I said, this is CAR's goal of not supporting us with any broker type of compensation. So, final word on this: if you were to use the form that we've produced, because you have a situation that where the listing agent is agreeable to compensate the buyer side expenses, or the buyer side has negotiated that with a listing agent to do that, and you want to use that form, if there's a dispute between brokers about payment of that compensation, because CAR has said they're not going to support this for our businesses any longer, what that would mean is you could not call Car Legal. They will not give you any advice concerning broker compensation, other than they will say, we don't support that. You'll need to call your own attorney for advice. And that's unfortunate, but that's the position they've taken. So this is the first of the more detailed forms training classes that I wanted to come out with for you. I apologize for the the messiness of my notes, but there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to remember to discuss with y'all. I'll put once we distribute the video or make the video of this available, I'll also have a link where you can refer to this document as well. I'll make that shareable with everybody. So look forward to the next one. I'll probably be putting one out on a couple other topics, mainly probably the listing agreement and some other things, just to follow up with these new forms and how they might work. So stay tuned for that stuff down the road. Hope I didn't bore you too much, but thanks for spending time with me. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.